also kind of a materialist view as well. It's this notion that the way humans produce goods determines the intelligence of the humans, thus the outcome of the society. And so just using them, just saying we're in capitalism is saying we are in the capitalist mode of production. And this capitalist mode of production is a mindset that determines everything. And we know that's not true. The capitalists aren't, quote unquote capitalists, aren't determining anything, right? The state's doing it.
Welcome to Activist NNT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today I talk with Wesley Wiles about the false historical modes of production and how they relate to MMT. The primary source of this information is the 700-page 2021 book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, by the late anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow. Essentially, Graeber and Wengrow reject the myth that as civilization becomes larger and more complex, it must necessarily also become more unequal. This myth and its false modes of production assert that ever-increasing inequality is unfortunate but necessary. In the same vein, mainstream economics' assertion that a federal deficit is always bad, a balanced budget always better, and a surplus always best means that the government's budget position is more important than the real-world condition of millions of human beings. This, in turn, implies that austerity, too, is unfortunate but necessary. The truth is that the only reason inequality or austerity is unfortunate but necessary is if we choose for it to be that way. We can choose differently. The real challenge is to stand up to those who benefit greatly from these things not changing. Because in both of these cases, it's a matter of life and death for us as individuals and as a human species. Wesley's provided some other valuable video lectures and panels, links to which you can find in the show notes. They include a panel discussion on the book The Dawn of Everything with Wengrow, Stephanie Kelton, and others. There's also an excellent panel discussion on rentier capitalism with Graeber, Guy Standing, and Michael Hudson, filmed only days before Graeber's untimely death. And now, on to my conversation with Wesley Wiles. Enjoy.
I've been getting really into Graeber stuff this last month, so I've just been diving into tons and tons of that. There's always something to learn. I mean, that's
reading or watching.
Yeah, read his book, and then just going through interviews with him, and then also with Wengrow, the two of them together, and then also separate, just to really further get into what they're talking about.
Yeah, I never heard of him before. That was the first time I saw him in the interview. It was good. It was good.
Yeah.
But all those things were good. I mean, I kind of knew some of it, but that was much deeper than I had kind of encountered before. But actually, I have a recommendation for you that I have a feeling kind of is the center of it all, like the foundation under which all of these things lie. Polanyi's Great Transformation.
Sure, the Polanyi's Transformation. I haven't read it, and I've it's one on my list and stuff, and I definitely will need to read it. Wengrow and Graeber, they definitely get into Polanyian stuff. And I think they have some stuff that, they point out that there's a few things that against the evolutionist narrative that kind of these guys are actually set out to kind of attack early on, not just political economy like itself, or trying to battle an evolutionist narrative that kind of started in the 1700s under.
Okay.
So really, the issue is just a historical narrative that's used for all of these other economic bases, all these other economic analysis, right? And so if you start off thinking within these stage categories, where humans were kind of, their intelligence was destined by or determined by the way they materially produce goods, like that is a fallacy in itself. And that's historical narratives kind of being created and reproduced by those modes that reinforce that narrative.
Okay.
We see that China, Middle East, Africa all had extremely organized, highly advanced civilizations, right? But during kind of that 1600s to 1800s era, when kind of the French Enlightenment is kind of developing, they're taking this historical narrative, but also kind of applying it to like a modern situation. It's like, oh, look, these people, they are living in kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes. They must have no history. They just must be primordially tribal hunter-gatherer people, and they don't have any intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, as more work's done from historians and archaeologists and everything like that, they're like, oh, actually, all these civilizations have a pretty rich history of having highly advanced or highly organized societies. And actually, it turns out a lot of the things that Europeans or the Western world thinks is achievements of theirs is actually things taken from these other societies, like tax and money, law, ideas of freedom, critiques against private property. Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, so these things came from all these other continents that were being eventually get called less evolved, and so they can't critique European society.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think what I take away from just MMT in itself is, along with these other kind of academic places like where Graeber is and Wengrow and stuff, is that there's false narratives of things, and then there's like reality, right? MMTers and stuff like to say MMT describes reality. I think it's kind of like that is the point, right? Is that there's all of this moral philosophy and ideology that obviously has been tied up with false historical categories.
Okay.
Right. And so some of this stuff is great, but it's pointless because now
is that a dog or a baby in the background?
A dog, sorry. Yeah, she's like a baby. She does this whine thing. Himalaya, stop.
Sorry.
There's like, that's why we need to read all of it, learn all of it, right? I think something that's quite often expressed the heterodox MMT community is reading all of the stuff, learning all of it. Like the history of economics is kind of what I mean, right? Which is going to take you through places and to people that you will disagree with and can be proven wrong, right? But you still kind of need to go through the history, so like, I don't think that any of these people need to be disregarded in that fact where you can't read them or something. But yeah, what they're all missing, or it's actually what they're all including, is a false historical narrative. And so the point of those four stage categories, those don't exist, right? The four stages of society that's just widely accepted across the aisle is the tribal of the hunter-gatherer, slave society, feudal, capitalist mode of production, right? Stage category system. Basically the foundation to the stage society theory, which has no evidence of being true. It there was no really ability to prove it really at the time either, as it being developed, in the 1700s. It's like another barter theory, right? Where barter theory is kind of embraced and popularized by kind of Adam Smith and stuff in the Scottish Revolution there at the time. And there was no way for him to prove that theory, right? And then as time goes on, archaeologists, anthropologists disprove barter theory of money. So it's along the same lines with the mode of production categories, right? Which the mode of production categories aren't just describing the system of material production. It's also categorizing the intelligence of the humans in society. It's a historical category. And it's also a category trying to describe the state, being that the state or the society is limited, determined by that mode of subsistence, right? And so there's really no evidence for this notion that, Rousseau, who himself is saying, oh, slavery didn't exist until agriculture, which is on its face untrue. Right? It's completely ignoring the way humans are developed and the way humans are developing society, and turns it over to the material way they produce goods is the agency, basically, right? That determines the intelligence of the people and thus determines the way that they develop their society and their state. And if they don't slave people, or if they're not in a feudalistic mode of production, then they can't possibly offer us any critique because they don't understand the nature of hierarchy in this developed system, this developed economy or developed society.
Okay. Okay. Well, why don't we back up? And I'd like to ask you, can you introduce yourself? Can you talk about how you came to MMT and how you came to these more, I'll say deeper things. That's not the right term, but these more broader things that you're talking about now.
Yeah, sure. All right. Yeah, I'm Wesley Wiles, and really came to MMT just by chance. Really, I mean, of course, I was swept up in the Bernie 2016 and then the Bernie 2020 kind of online, campaigns. But it was really in between those two that I finally got kind of found by MMTers and actually started asking questions about what they were saying, where I'd been kind of, during those two periods, everybody was following each other en masse, right? Like basically, if you were a Bernie supporter, you got followed on Twitter and on Facebook, right? And so during the first campaign, I think it was just had more accepted the more orthodox Marxist framework of macroeconomics, which is neoclassical. That is what Richard Wolff and David Harvey and stuff is
David Harvey. Ugh.
Yeah.
I'll never forget his critique of MMT.
Yeah, that is the macroeconomic framing that they're offering is neoclassical macro. It's, we don't even have to get into, and I've had plenty of words to say on Twitter with Wolff myself, because like I said, before I got to MMT, I had gotten also brushed in with kind of the Occupy movement, which really funneled you into some of these heterodox lanes. But which Marxism and radical Marxism is absolutely a part of that. But the more popular Marxist like intellects and academics are more orthodox, actually, when it comes to the macroeconomics. But when you're in kind of political fervor, words and virtue signaling and stuff like that are, have a lot more value to you. You kind of prioritize them in a way, right? You're like, oh, wow, they said that. So we have the same mindset. So really, without the frame of reference that I'd learned from MMT, I didn't know I was wrong or they were wrong. That was just the dominant narrative, right? You got a tax to fund anything. If you spend too much, you'll get inflation. I mean, that is the framework that's being churned out with the Orthodox Marxist crowd. Not all, but the more popular. Like, fortunately,
Well, more popular because they churn out that stuff.
well, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's not a coincidence. Yeah, it's not. That's not a coincidence. You're right. But fortunately, I'd gotten crowded into Steve Keen and Michael Hudson's work already before kind of getting into MMT. And these are already MMT sort of adjacent. And, Michael Hudson, an MMTer, I would consider. I think he considers himself it as well. He toured with, Stephanie and stuff in Italy teaching it. Though he has, the MMT community is not homogenous in itself. So I had already been hearing the debt peonage and forgiving their debts is something that I'd already kind of absorbed and took it on. And so when I was getting people underneath my feed, like on Facebook in 2017 and 18, and we're talking about birdie stuff and, Medicare for all, they're like, we'll pay for it with MMT, right? I think that was really like one of the first like lines that just like caught me off guard. And I was like, what is MMT? What, because at first I was like, yeah, we'll do it. We'll pay with it with MMT. Like, I didn't say that, but like hit like or something, it's like, of course. Right? But then I'm like, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? And of course you don't pay with it for it with MMT, but that line just was trying to be a short line saying like, no, it's not the taxes that are going to fund it. Like, we pay for it because of the MMT framework we'll show you, right? Which is because the government is a sovereign issuer of its own currency, right? Like, the taxes don't work the same way at the federal level as they do at the state, right? Like, so this is when I'm like, oh, what have I been learning this whole time, right? Why have I been spending hours of my time arguing with people that were friends maybe in high school or something, but now kind of libertarian. I live in Northern California, about an hour and a half from Paradise, the town that burned down, and Bernie released his Green New Deal plan in 2020. So this is for California, it's a very conservative red bastion for 70 years. Very not like your George Bush conservative. You're much more the Tea Party libertarian, right? The Tea Party really took throttle here. Like, we have this whole state of Jefferson separatist movement, but there's a lot of aspects to that as well, right? Like the Sinclair Media Corporation monopoly on,
channels,
or on cable channels. They own
news stations,
channels. Your basic cable channels. Like, they own 23 stations between here and the coast and the Klamath Falls. This like hot spot of where it's rural and isolated, but all of the basically all the cable channels are kind of monopolized by basically Sinclair that just runs Coke network stuff through it, so everyone's pretty much captured by that. And it's a bastion here, a conservative bastion for a long time. And, that's not going to change. I don't think you really have to get down and explain it to them. And I've done that multiple times over here, and actually with a few older timers that were more of that kind of classical conservative type. Like, they get it. You talk to them, you say, no, the taxes come second, right? Like, the federal government spends, you can't tax until that money's in circulation.
Let me ask you: do do you see any problems with MMT, or does MMT enable and facilitate these larger, broader issues that are important to you?
No, the MMT, I have not found anything, any problems with MMT at all. I mean, who am I to say? But besides, it takes minds to check all these things.
But
But
but I mean
MMT,
you
in
started
discussion,
off our very beginning. You started off by saying very important people have very important stuff wrong. But I
sure.
don't think that MMT necessarily. I'm asking. I don't think it does. That MMT necessarily touches on those things, which shows that they compartmentalize what they do well.
Yeah, I would agree with the way you finished that. I've MMT isn't affected really by anything of the stage society kind of misconceptions, out of Rousseau and stuff. Uh, they basically share a same historical narrative, and it's not a narrative really, right? This is the evidence being found. This is what Assyriologists are describing, that money has existed for this long. Other archaeologists and Graeber and these guys, they're not arguing against that. They're like, that's also their narratives, right? So really, MMTers share much more in common with Graeber than David Harvey or Richard Wolff, specifically because of the historical narrative. But the most important thing, right, is the historical narrative, which is also one of the most important things about MMT, right? Is the operational mechanisms that's just being described, which doesn't need anything besides somebody looking at it like Mosler and just accurately describing it. Right?
Doesn't require history. That's interesting.
Yeah, but then there is the broader part of MMT, which includes the historical narrative, which is something that's being constantly fought, right? The dominant narrative, the orthodox narrative, or whatever the mainstream academics is, that money is just this thing that came out of barter, which the barter is like, that's what it's doing, is creating this historical narrative, as well as creating a narrative about the state, which is that the state didn't have anything to do with it. So, so MMT helps. Understanding that these categories were bullshit helps a ton, because then you're like, yeah, we already know that there's these legal and institutional networks kind of developed by social relationships that are creating the state. There's no, we're not trying to separate intelligence to determine these things. We're saying these things have been there for a long time, like the way MMT, once you do a little bit of study on it, the way that the taxpayer money kind of narrative, or when you see it being used, described federal finance, it's a psychological tick, right, for MMTers. They see it and they're like, ugh, they cringe. They're like, that's not correct. It's reproducing a racist and classist narrative. It's reproducing the false historical narrative. Well, that's basically what the dawn of everything and that kind of work does to motive production categories, right? Because it's really attacking the stage society theory and the evolutionist narrative in itself, that's that kind of 4-stage category thing, saying Native Americans can't possibly critique Europeans because they're dirty savages, right? Like that's the issue that's going on there. And MMT doesn't fall into that. And MMT is also involved in studies that's describing ancient society, which is also describing how states are developed.
Well, I'd like to ask you, your overall thing of, that I get, like, motive production and whatever, like the major things that you think, like, Wolf is missing, and I don't even know, like, that the left has wrong. The major things that the left has wrong. Can you give like a primer on what those concepts are? Because I don't really have my head around what you're talking about, let alone why it's wrong.
Yeah, sure. The issue is the categories in itself. So, I mean, with the left, its probably biggest problems is that it reproduces false categories, false
What's a
historical narratives.
category?
A category, like a category is basically the way of quantifying a period of something, like a period of time, a period of history in a sense. Like these are historical categories that are also describing the way that the material goods were produced in them. But the way that the modes of production categories, right? So mode of production is a category. And so what I'm meaning, like this type of category, what it's doing is saying that society was limited to be this certain way because of the way it produced goods. And so the hierarchy within it is such because of that. And they couldn't possibly understand maybe to do something different because they had not developed into a different category of human evolution, which is the next stage, the next mode of production, right? So if you were in slave society, you couldn't possibly understand feudalistic stage. If you're in feudalistic stage, you couldn't possibly understand the capitalist stage. And although like this ground isn't really ground being argued for by the left, the reproduction of the mode of production categories does it for them. That's what these categories were meant to do. And so there's things that we are describing, like everyone may be describing exploitation, wage slavery, this and that. These things are happening. These things are real. But what's not real is the mode of production category in itself. And we see it being abused constantly, right? Where it's like there's human effect, whatever, human things being personified onto capitalism as if capitalism is this invisible hand wandering around telling people what to do, right? It's the algorithm. Like this is stuff coming from the left that are naturalizing this idea that the way we produce goods creates the agency on which we develop intelligence. And so what's the problem is naturalizing these categories instead of rejecting the categories. The mode of production is also kind of a materialist view as well. It's this notion that the way humans produce goods determines the intelligence of the humans, thus the outcome of the society. And so just using them, just saying we're in capitalism is saying we are in the capitalist mode of production. And this capitalist mode of production is a mindset that determines everything. And we know that's not true. The capitalists aren't, quote unquote capitalists, aren't determining anything, right? The state's doing it. Mm-hmm. The capitalist mode of production itself is also flawed, right? Because it's giving agency to the private sector, right? The monopsony from these bourgeois and their hold on the means of production. We know this is incorrect from MMT because MMT points out that the labor market, the labor force, is created by the state's coercive tax. The tax is set, then people have to go out and labor. Then after that coercive act creates this market, this labor pool, then capitalists or whatever you want to call them are free to exploit that labor pool. And then they pay with a wage of the state currency, right, that the people are looking for. So there's exploitation and all of this stuff going on, but the monopoly on creating the worker, that forces the worker to go to work isn't just by nature of these people, these bourgeois holding certain, productive means. And so it's not just that those modes are race science that are trying to categorize history in a way that like separates certain types of societies. It's also incorrectly describing the state. The capitalists aren't forcing people to work. The tax makes people have to go to work. Mm-hmm. And if you don't provide anything, or if you allow the private sector to do that, well, then that's the prerogative of the state to allow them to freely exploit that labor pool. But that labor pool is also not just this natural state of people wanting to produce things, kind of like some of the classical economic narratives, which is naturalizing categories that didn't exist, that don't exist.
And according to Polanyi, the very notion of capitalism, the very state of capitalism, the idea of capitalism doesn't exist. It's an impossibility. It's a utopia.
Oh yeah,
It is, definitely. And the only reason that it exists, the only reason that the illusion exists, is because they have commodified people, land, and labor, land, and money. Sure. And when those things run out, not money, of course, but when labor and land run out, then the illusion is done. And obviously, with the climate crisis, it's pretty clear that that's on its way. They have to annihilate land and labor, the society, basically,
sure,
in order to make their illusion, in order to perpetuate their illusion.
Yeah, and that's where I think like MMT and stuff like that is super important, because then all of a sudden now you're discussing what's real and what's not real, right? And I think that's something like it's not a loss for the left to reject these false historical narratives, right? In categories like the mode of production categories. The issue is that while there was critiques of European hierarchy being made, there was also a reaction to it. Like the problem is that by the time it got to the Enlightenment thinkers, they were all basically writing fictional characters of kind of the Conde Rock that had actually been making the discussion, basically because writing about a native critiquing European hierarchy would get you outcast or imprisoned or something. You know what I mean? But then they also embrace the conservative historical narrative, right? Which is saying things of develop in these stages. And so you basically get an embracement of the critique of European hierarchy, and then an embracement of the reaction to the critique, which develops into the stage society theory, which is humans evolve in modes, different stages, and they're less evolved the further stage, right? So the entire left discourse at this point is trying to satisfy contradictions. So the left doesn't lose anything by getting rid of these categories. It opens them up. It frees them up to actually start analyzing and discussing what's real stuff. So really that's that's the biggest problem with not moving on from the mode of production categories, or not moving on from like the barter catalytic money theory, which kind of which dominates the left, and Marx did write about, and he did write articles defending the barter myth and kind of attacking credit theory, which, to his foil, he was wrong, obviously. He does come to write later as he's developing his legal career that money is actually more of a state power. But the popular left, your major intellects like David Harvey, they're not talking about that. They're just still talking about the kind of the capital theory where it's like money is this dead labor sort of thing, which is still a commodity theory framework. They're still trying to attach it to something, right? There's something out there somewhere, some dead labor that created the money, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem with accepting it, I think, is something that Bill is no different than what Bill Mitchell talks about with neoclassicals and the mainstream, is that they've done work, or they've done videos and stuff like that, talking about this as if it's the Chapo boys are still just like capitalism is this algorithm just telling you what to do. It's like, no, even if you were to accept these categories in their state, like capitalist mode of production is talking about objective economic structures, not a mindset that's just floating around guiding rich people. I don't even know what each individual Marxist academic thinks mode of production means. They don't even talk about the category in itself. It is just all accepted as fact. And this is something, and then I think the reason that I've really dove down Graeber's stuff lately is that there's so much similar to MMT's kind of fight in the mind of citizens, right? Because essentially that's really is what's going on. It's a fight over the mind. It's the bunch of us might share the same sentiment or want the same policy, but if we're not on the same page about the real structures, objective things like how money is created, we're just sabotaging each other. It doesn't matter if we organize. If we're all on different pages, it's just going to sabotage itself. Every minute we're arguing over whether taxes fund spending. I'm saying, like, this is how the left is sabotaging itself. One of them, right?
When you don't agree on reality, then every other conversation is meaningless because you're talking on two different bases of reality.
Exactly. And that's where we are. That's where the Western left or the US left or whatever you want to call it, that's where we're on. Nobody is on the same page. We are not sharing the same reality. And a big part of why we see that, to separate these institutions, these institutional like mechanisms like money from the state. Yes, coming from kind of this anti-government narrative, the idea that you can separate money is really rooted in a false historical narrative. The barter myth. I mean, that's what I believed before learning any better. I mean, who else is out there to tell you any different, right?
It's deliberately kept from you.
Yeah, and it's deliberately kept from you.
There's plenty of people to tell you.
Sure.
It's being kept, yeah.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, you're not going to turn on any radio or any news channel and hear them talking about that, especially as MMT has been gaining foothold, like starting from nothing in the 90s to some blogging to, now it's finally making mainstream and stuff. Well, I mean, it's hit mainstream a few times, like with the 2008 crash kind of era, but now it's sticking, right? Now all of a sudden, MMT is hardly removed from the topic of discussion. Maybe not on television, but all the news sites between Bloomberg or someone somewhere trying to critique MMT. I see lots of critiques of MMT lately, which I think is a good thing because that means
we're straddling the laugh at you. Yeah, the laugh at you, fight you stages right now.
Yeah. I feel that kind of that's something that's going on too. Definitely. It's not a loss for the left to confront this, not reject it fully, but keep things that make sense from analysis out of all types. There's a rich history of people analyzing society, trying to break down problems that comes from Smith and Cardo and Marx and the classical economics and stuff. There's rich history and there's rich analysis, but there's also a lot that's not even real. But the first problem is going to be to get the left to understand this, to get them to accept the evidence and come to a conclusion, at least a broadly similar conclusion that, okay, we're right to criticize property laws and allowing private property to kind of create, hierarchy and stratification. We're right about these other things, but we have some other things that are just fundamentally wrong, right? Like we're not just yearning for this primitive freedom that only existed within communal tribal systems, right? The idea that all hunter-gatherers were homogeneously egalitarian. It was never real. It was never true. Some people I've talked to about this have just fully rejected. Like, they don't even want to talk about the evidence. They just want to kind of get into an argument about Marx. Like I said, I have been a Marxist for longer than I was in an MMTer. But it's like the more I've learned about MMT, I've just begun questioning everything at this point. And now I'm at the point, it's like, I'm not afraid to completely burn it down, right? In a sense.
If we don't, it's going to burn us down.
Exactly. If we don't, nothing is going to change. Not even the narrative of how we categorize economies and like that, and that's not going to change. It's just going to be this further broadening these categories and what's included in them. We're just saying capitalism is responsible for all this shit all the time. We're just coming up with new shit for it to be responsible for, and that is just insanity. Finance, capital or financial derivatives, debt at work, none of these are inventions of capitalism. These things, if you want to even stay within that Rousseau framework of stage society, the mode production categories, the feudalist production system was dominated by finance, right? It was not like, so the classical economists that are kind of like the origins of where the capitalist mode of production comes out of, like Adam Smith and them, they are specifically saying the only capitalism is only going to occur once it eliminates these remnants, these feudal remnants, which is finance, right? Rentier, the bond class. The bond class has never been not in control, right? It's finance is still dominating the global economic system. Yeah, so really, like, MMT has been the most mind-expanding thing I've ever delved into, right? And I've read a bunch of Marxist stuff.
So actually, you know what? I think I would actually phrase it a different way. I can't know what you're thinking, but MMT eliminates the chains that stop you from being able to see all the other stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'll accept that. It does. MMT helps it with the argument about the political will in MMT and stuff, right? What MMT does is eliminate stuff. It eliminates false truths and false choices. So it strengthens any political movement that uses it, not just left, but also right. If the finance sector, which Stephanie Kelton has made a point, like, they're the ones that seem the most interested in it, right? The financial sector, which is also the one spending the most money on programs and segments on news to dump on MMT, are also the ones most serious about it. Like, because they know it's useful, because it's actually describing reality, not because anything inherently helps anybody better or more than the others. It's just because it's actually describing what's going on. Even if you're deep in a big, movement of some sort, to not use it is dooming you. Like Jill Stein, who's got the best intentions, is very intelligent, but then just get, trolled on, live national TV because she's calling debt cancellation QE. So it just understand these the operational realities is essential. But anyway, I have to say, being that it is the MMT podcast, we really didn't touch too much on it. MMT is definitely one of the most important things I've ever learned. Probably, I've never understood state power better. I've never understood history better. Like, even when people are talking about things that are corrected in historical narratives, like David Graeber, but who is not, an economist himself. Even he might say something that's not quite correct, and it's like the mainstream. You would hear it anywhere else. You yourself can be like, oh. Like, so you're able to kind of really dissect more things that you're listening to. Anything that's talking about the state, right? This is like, that's what I meant earlier, is it's not that that MMT is telling you exactly what state power means, but it shows you how it is working. It is show you that, no, these money's not fake. It's no more fake than law is, right? It's created by these networks, these institutional networks, these legal networks, all these things, right, are a part of it, right? And so, yeah, like that is something that MMT helps anybody with, is all of a sudden, yeah, it strips away a bunch of kind of the BS, and it really actually lets you look at how these things, these, like I said, objective structures, not to be waxing on about philosophically, legitimate economic structures, right? And so this is very important, because now you know where you should be putting your effort into. And I mean, I think this kind of left versus right paradigm that we've kind of been shoved into isn't really helping by arguing on philosophical grounds, right? I think if you start kind of with some of these economic structures, then you can be like, see, it's not nature, we're creating them. And then you can kind of get onto some philosophical topics with your neighbors and stuff like that, where it's fruitful, right? Instead of just kind of, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. And then, that you kind of end the conversation, because you don't want there to be a political argument between a neighbor or your friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, MMT is it's probably been one of the most enlightening things I've gotten into.
Cool. All right. Well, that's a good place to stop. Wesley, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
We've been seeing each other online for quite a long time now. So
I think me and you need to have just a phone call or something, just to bullshit about stuff and weed out things, and then maybe have
cool.
Then maybe I'll give you a better interview, more specific, because
you give good interviews when they're not recorded.
Yeah, probably.
You said you wanted to do your own podcast, right?
Yeah, I am looking to do my own podcast. I'm kind of getting all this stuff set up for it now and stuff. I really feel that heterodox, just the concept, just the category heterodox is really not understood at all. And then even when you do kind of get into it, there's not a lot of sources that are just kind of focused on talking about what heterodox kind of means to us, like in the context of today. And but then also including all of like the schools from it, which is MMT and post Keynesian in its in itself, which is they're slightly separate but still part of this, radical Marxism, a part of it, institutionalism. There's all these aspects that are informing each other. With, like, I think one of the best things about MMT was that it does that, right? Is that it has it's got like Mosler economics paper, right? But then it also has all of these other things informing stuff as like the community and kind of everything's growing around it, right? You got the legal side of it, you got linguistics, you got all this other stuff that's, you got institutionalists coming on the shows talking about stuff, informing the way we understand stuff. So, and of course it's going to be mainly through MMT lens, though. Like, I'll be coming from it at an MMT perspective.
All right, dude, we got to say goodbye. It's hard saying goodbye to you, but I'm saying goodbye.
Right, yeah. All right, man.
No,
right,
it's been fun. I will see you back on Twitter, and thanks for doing this.
Hope this wasn't too much of a mess for you.
Nah, it's all good. It's all good. How can it not be? How can it not be all over the place?
There's so much out there. It's crazy.
Music for this show is by RecTech. You can find RecTech on SoundCloud and Spotify at WRECK_TECH. To record Activist MMT, I use the iOS phone app Tape-A-Call Plus for recording phone calls and Zencaster for internet-based recordings. My post-production workflow starts by editing on the iOS app AnyTune Pro Plus, then transferring those timestamps to my Windows desktop. At that point, I crudely process the audio in Audacity and then implement the edits and do all the final processing in the Reaper digital audio workstation. Activist MMT is hosted by Libsyn, and the video teasers are created with the online Headliner app.